Well, hey everyone, I'm Janet B., recovered from compulsive eating and bulimia. Let me add my welcome to Melissa's. Happy that y'all are here with us on the last day of summer, kind of. So, if you were with us 2 weeks ago, we did the first half of We Agnostics, and that chapter is so rich, split it up. So, we are going to finish up. So, I'll try and summarize in a couple minutes what we did so far. The beginning of We Agnostic says, in the preceding chapters, you've learned something of alcoholism or compulsive eating. Well, what have we learned, right? What did we learn in step one? And it's summarized at the bottom of page 43. They say, once more, the alcoholic, the compulsive eater, at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink, the first bite, except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. So capital H, capital P, and on page 46, they're really clear that it's impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. And they tell us our own conception of God is fine, but we have to have a conception that makes sense. And they go through the things that might block us, the different prejudices. Maybe the way we were raised made us think, well, if there is a God, he's a pretty rotten being. Or, well, there's people who claim to believe in God and they're not very nice, so how could there be a God? Or, I can't believe in something I don't understand. But they tell us that half the original founders of AA were atheists or agnostic, but they didn't stay that way. They saw they had to find a spiritual basis of life. And they said, what's our power? Our problem? Is it lack of a good food plan? Is it lack of knowledge? Is it lack of willingness? And page 45 tells us no, lack of power is our dilemma. And then they tell us the mission statement of this book. They say, its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. And it says, that means, of course, we are going to talk about God. So we talked a little bit about that, went through some of the details in the book, and we finished up last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, page 47. And we'll pick up there. They say we have to ask ourselves one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? Am I willing to believe? It's interesting. They use that word willing when they talk about who can work the steps at the beginning of chapter 5. They say, if you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. And here they use that word willing again. It's like a decision. Am I going to decide that I will try to believe? And then they say, as soon as a man says he believes or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him he's on his way. Well, how can they do that? If I became willing to believe in Santa Claus, does that mean Santa Claus is going to come down my chimney on December 24th and leave presents? Well, no. But they're saying that because there really is a God and they knew it, right? They said this is something all of us agreed on. Get 100 alcoholics to agree on anything. They all believed not only in the existence of God, but that we could access the power of God so that he could work a miracle in our lives and remove the food obsession and transform us, or at least transform me from the selfish, self-centered person I was to someone who's like not quite that way anymore. So they say it's been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a willingness to believe, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. So that kind of implies that God wants us to believe in him and wants us to have a relationship with him. Well, why? Is God some egomaniac who needs, a bunch of addicts to crawl around worshiping him? No, he loves us and he knows that by us having a relationship with him, our lives are going to be so much better. He wants what's best for us, right? Think of page 100. It says, the things that came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned. So I want to be in those hands. And this chapter tells us how. So page 47, they continue and they say, okay, that was great news for us. Like, that we can start with willingness, for we assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith, which seemed difficult to believe. Okay, what are spiritual principles? So I think part of them are trusting and relying on God. But then there's spiritual principles we can start practicing from day one, even if we're not quite sure about God. We can start being honest. That's a spiritual principle. We can start doing acts of self sacrifice in order to help other people. Those are spiritual principles. It says we can commence at a simpler level. We can do what we know. We can commence. So it's like God meets us where we are. And here I'm going to tell you a true story. It was told by a sponsor of mine. She was in OA and AA, and she lived near an army base. And the army wouldn't send a bus of soldiers over to her house for the AA meetings. She and her husband had to go get them. And talk about someone who had to commence at a simple level and God meeting him where he was. So she was talking, probably similarly to how I'm talking. And this soldier said, I'll believe in God if I see a burning bush. Well, in her living room was a halogen lamp, a tall lamp, and a tall potted plant. And at that moment, somehow the plant fell over and caught on fire. Not only did he believe, but there was such a transformation that after that, the army sent them over in a bus. God meets us where we are. If we're not sure there's a God, we can tell him that. We can say, God, I'm not sure you exist, but if you exist, please help me. And I'll try to be honest and unselfish while I'm waiting for your help. God will meet us where we are. So it tells us 47, 48 that, yeah, we're people who don't really accept much on faith, or we think we don't. And we're handicapped by being obstinate, sensitive, prejudiced. And they said this thinking had to be abandoned. And they said alcohol was the great persuader to abandon that unreasonable thinking. Of course, I could say, like, there's no way I'm going to even think about chemotherapy. But God forbid if I went to the doctor and he said, you have stage 4 cancer, suddenly I'm going to be open minded. And I'm going to skip this because I realize I actually did these pages. And I actually went to page 51. So I'll just be real quick. One line I'll point out again because I think it's so important for us. Page 49, the first full paragraph, tells us how we are supposed to view ourselves. It says, instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever advancing creation, we chose to believe our human intelligence was the last word. But look at how we're supposed to view ourselves. You ever hear that expression, we're just bozos on a bus? I hate that expression. I'm not a bozo. I'm an intelligent agent, right? God gave us brains to use. And then what's our role as an agent? An agent works for a principal. The principal has work that for the agent to do. Spearheads of God's ever advancing creation. God's recreating people like us, and he wants us to help. So I'm going to skip to page 51 because I think that is actually where I left off. And it talks about the things that fetter us, that block us. Superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas. These things can be blocked. So we need to look at, what are my superstitions? What are my fixed ideas that maybe are wrong? And they say, aren't we just as biased and unreasonable about spiritual things as people who thought that a plane could never fly, that it just could never work? Um, And they said, yeah, people said God left flying to the birds, but page 52. But 30 years later, the conquest of the air was almost an old story and airplane travel was in full swing. Now, none of us think about it. Like, of course, there's airplanes that fly. And they say in every generation, we see a change of thinking. Um, probably 10 years ago, none of us thought that there would be cars that drive themselves. And though they're not perfected yet, there are cars that drive themselves. I think they're like out delivering pizzas and stuff like that. Um, and we say, okay, yeah, it's possible that there's going to be cars that drive themselves. And they say, shouldn't we apply to our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view? And then it talks about what we should look at in ourselves and how to really know if we're not doing too well, if we're having trouble with personal relationships. We can't control our emotions. We're miserable. We're depressed. We have trouble making a living. We feel useless, fearful, and unhappy. All of those are the results of living a life in self-will, right? And not to say that if we don't live in self-will, we'll be happy 100% of the time, but we'll be happy a lot of the time, maybe not 100, but pretty close. And they say, okay, so, you're sitting there and you're willing to believe that there's going to be cars that drive themselves, but shouldn't you be just as open-minded that there's a solution to your problems? Shouldn't you open your mind the same way? And they say, we all have faith, right? Every time I sit on a chair, I have faith that it's not going to fall. Why? Because I've sat on 100 chairs before in my life and none of them have fallen. So I trust the chairs aren't going to fall. Well, if you look and you see 100 people who have relied on God and recovered, pretty good opportunity that that's a chair we should sit down in. And they say that when we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our ideas didn't work. And then they talk about the Wright brothers, and I always find that so interesting. They say their almost childish faith that they could build a machine that could fly was the mainspring of their accomplishment. Without that, nothing could have happened. I mean, I would have thought it was because they knew like physics and aerodynamics or whatever else you have to know to get like wind shears and all that. But they're saying no, the main thing, the thing that made it happen was their faith. They go so far as to say, without their faith, nothing could have happened. I mean, that's a pretty strong claim. And why is that? Well, because in the spiritual world, faith is the currency, right? Imagine like a Martian looking down on me, going to the grocery store, handing the clerk some like green and white paper or this plastic card, and in return getting bags of groceries or getting gas in my car. It wouldn't make any sense to them, right? The Martians don't know that money is the currency on Earth. But I can't hand God my American Express card and say, help. Faith is the currency in the spiritual world, and it's activated generally by prayer, by trust, by doing what I think God would want me to, and just letting Him handle the results. And they say, yeah, we began to feel like the people who insisted the Wrights would never fly. Sure, there are a lot of people saying these Wright brothers, they don't know what they're doing. But they changed their mind when they had evidence. And so this program gives us evidence, I think in a couple ways, as I mentioned, first by seeing other people who've recovered. And then when we try it, it's just weird. Life just starts working. The obsession with food diminishes and then goes away. Things just fall into place. We're not, we become thermostats rather than thermometers, right? We can change the temperature in the room. We're not affected by every little thing that happens to us. And they say, listen, logic is great stuff. We believed it. And we think it's logical that when we were crushed by a self-imposed crisis, we could not postpone or evade, page 53. We had to fearlessly face the proposition, either God is everything or he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? So they're saying it's a choice, it's a decision. God is everything. I always think that's like an interesting way they put it. Like, obviously, like, God isn't my pen and God isn't my eyeglasses. That would just be silly. I think they mean we have to ultimately give God everything, or it's as if we gave him nothing, right? God is described as a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things. Like, we all have an opportunity to access the love and the power of God. That, I believe, is what they're telling us. And they say, okay, we're squarely confronted with the question of faith. But let's think about it. Don't we really have faith? Page 54. Don't we believe in our have faith in our own ability to think? And they say, and by the way, not just faith, we're worshipers. We are all hardwired to worship. And they mention things that we've worshiped: other people, sentiment, things, money, and ourselves. By the way, it's interesting that alcohol isn't on this list, and nor should food be on this list. When people say, I made a God out of food, I worshiped food, that's incorrect. None of us did that. What we did is we worshiped ourselves and lived on self-will, and that created a vacuum so that the illness of compulsive eating could come in. It's like we tilled the soil, the right kind of soil in our souls, that the illness of compulsive eating would thrive on. We didn't worship food, we worshiped ourselves, and then we had no choice whatsoever when we came to food. When it came to food, we were powerless. So that's why the solution isn't, if it was we were worshiping food, the solution would be the opposite of that, which I don't know, would be to not worship food. But because we're worshiping ourselves, the opposite is to worship God and to serve other people. So they tell us we are worshiped, and worship really has nothing to do with reason. We look at a sunset, or, we just, I took a 2.8-mile walk with my husband in a park today, and it was beautiful. It was just beautiful. And it wasn't my logic that said, these trees, this lake is beautiful. There's just something in us. But of course, there'd be something wrong if I worshiped the trees or the lake. Ultimately, those good things are supposed to point me to the Creator. But they tell us faith, love, and worship, that really doesn't have to do with reason. And they say, imagine life without faith. If we're nothing left but pure reason, it wouldn't be life. It wouldn't be life. Page 55, they again talk kind of about the Wright brothers. They say, what about the people who proved man could never fly? Yet we had been seeing another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation from this world, people who rose above their problems. They said God made these things possible, and we only smiled. We had seen spiritual release, but liked to tell ourselves it wasn't true. Well, why on earth would we like to tell ourselves spiritual release isn't possible? Why aren't we just like so anxious to believe it? Like little kids are so anxious to believe in Santa Claus because they believe they'll get good gifts. Why aren't we as anxious to believe in God so that we get his good gifts? The best gift, of course, being himself. I think because we would rather be right than be healed sometime. We would rather dig in our heels and just prove that we're right. Um, and then my favorite line in the book. Actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. So that tells me when God created me, he gave me 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, 1 stomach, 1 heart, and somewhere in there, he planted the fundamental idea of himself. The knowledge of God is planted in us, the knowledge that he exists. But here's the problem. If you can say, well, how come then I don't believe? How come I have trouble believing? It, meaning the fundamental idea of God, may be obscured, blocked by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things. So it's like spiritual cataract. So what can block us from the really believing in God? Calamity, like bad things that have happened to us or those we loved. And that was a problem that Bill Wilson had, right? Page 11, he talks about the war he had seen. He said, if there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal. Calamity got in his way. Pomp. Well, that means I just want everything to go my way and I want everyone to think I'm the best and worship me and do whatever I want 5 seconds before I even ask for it. That's how I used to be. And worship of other things, other people, our careers, our kids, where our kids are going to go to college, who are they going to marry, when are they going to give me grandchildren, all that stuff, worship of other things. They say, okay, that obscures our idea of God, but in some form or other, it is there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. Faith in a power greater than ourselves. Okay, that's great. And I will tell you, I always believed in God from as early as I can remember. I was taught about God. I always believed in him. It meant nothing. It did nothing for me. And what didn't I have? I didn't have a miraculous demonstration of that power because I hadn't surrendered to him, cleaned up my past, lived a life trying to get closer to him and helping others. But they're talking about faith and a miraculous demonstration of God's power in our lives. And they say, okay, fine, we admit it. Well, it says you're going to have to search fearlessly, but he is there. It says he was as much a fact as we were. And they say we can only clear the ground a bit if our testimony helps sweep away prejudice. So we need to look at what are our prejudices against God. Enables us to think honestly. If we think, oh, religion produces only horrible people, well, we're not thinking honestly. We're not thinking of people like Mother Teresa, who religion produced. Encourages you to search diligently, then you can join us on the broad highway. And then they make a promise. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. The consciousness, like the awareness of what you really believe, it won't stay unconscious or subconscious. You will consciously be aware. They say it will surely come to you. And then they say, now we're going to tell you the story of a man who thought he was an atheist. By the way, notice they do that throughout the book. They say, if you think you're an atheist or agnostic, you think you don't believe. So they're talking about a man who thought he was an atheist. And this is, of course, the minister's son, whose story is told in Our Southern Friend. So here is our minister's son, page 56. He's in a hospital. He had some tough things in his life. People in his immediate family killed themselves. He had business failure, insanity, fatal illnesses, right? You imagine that. You go through, and in the course of a few years, a couple relatives die of COVID, couple kill themselves, couple are locked up in an insane asylum, and your business goes under. They say these things embittered him. He was angry and he was depressed. So here he is in a hospital and he's talking to another alcoholic and he's saying, if there is a God, he certainly hasn't done anything for me. But then something happens. Then he asks himself, is it possible all the religious people I've known are wrong? Well, what happened between if there is a God, he hasn't done anything for me, to becoming open-minded? And here it is. If you have your big book, we're on page 214, the actual story of our Southern Friend, our whole story. He's talking to another inmate in the insane asylum who he calls a fanatic. And he says, the man asks him if he believes in a power greater than himself, whether he calls that power God, Allah, Confucius, prime cause, divine mind, or anything else. And he says, but as for God, he said, I believe in electricity and nature, but as for God, if there is one, he hasn't done anything for me. And then the man asks him, Are you willing to right all the wrongs you've done, no matter how wrong you think the other person was? Are you willing to be honest with yourself about yourself? Tell someone about yourself and think of other people and their needs instead of yourself. And that'll get rid of the drink problem. And the man says, I'll do anything. And then his friend says, then all your troubles are over. And he leaves the room. And then he's perseverating on it. He's thinking about it. And he says, can all the worthwhile people I've known be wrong about God? So he's open-minded. Could I possibly be wrong in what I think? And remember, just like God met that guy in my former sponsor's house with a burning plastic plant, he met this guy with a voice. Who are you to say there is no God? He met him where he was. He challenged his pride. So what does he do? He gets back up, goes to his friend's room and says, okay, I have to ask you a question. How does prayer fit into this thing? And he answers, well, you've probably tried praying like I have. When you've been in a jam, you said, God, please do this or that. And if it turned out your way, that was the last of it. And if it didn't, you said, there isn't any God, or he doesn't do anything for me. Is that right? And the minister's son said, yes, right? Isn't that how I used to pray? Like God was Santa Claus. I'll give you my list of what I want you to do. And if you do, I won't think about you again. And if you don't, I'm not happy with you. But his friend says, that's not the way to pray. The thing I do is to say, God, here I am and here are all my troubles. I've made a mess of things and can't do anything about it. You take me and all my troubles and do anything you want with me. He says, does that answer your question? And the minister's son says, yes, it does. And listen to what happens to him. He says, it doesn't make sense. Suddenly, I feel a wave of utter hopelessness sweep over me. I am in the bottom of hell. And there a tremendous hope is born. It might be true. I tumble out of bed onto my knees. I know not what I say, but slowly a great peace comes to me. I feel lifted up. I believe in God. I crawl back into bed and sleep like a child. He was willing, and then God surely met him where he was. And back on page 56, it says he was overwhelmed by a conviction of the presence of God. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. The barriers he had built through the years were swept away. Just like in step 7, our defects of character, we humbly ask God to remove them, and he removes them. God removed the barrier that the minister's son had built. And what does the minister's son said? He said, I stood in the presence of infinite power and love. For the first time, but not the last time, he lived in conscious companionship with his creator. That's just an awareness that God is always with me and he cares about me. And it says that very night, his alcohol problem was taken away. Of course, because if we fill our hearts with God and then live it out through self-sacrifice for others, of course, our food problem can't live there. The soil of our soul is changed and it's not hospitable to this illness anymore. So page 57, they finish talking about the minister's son, and it says, seemingly he could not drink even if he would. God had restored his sanity. Page 84, once the spiritual malady has been overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. We need to solve this on a spiritual plane. And they say, what is this but a miracle of healing? Guys, remember, this program ultimately is about miracles. That's it. This is like how to have a miracle in 12 simple but not always easy steps. It says, what is this but a miracle of healing? Yet its elements are simple. What? They're telling me the elements of a miracle, like how to have a miracle. And they say, yeah, it's simple. 1, circumstances made him willing to believe. 2, he humbly offered himself to his maker. That's our step 3, our surrender, which Melissa will talk about next week. Then he knew. And they say, even so has God restored us all to our right minds. To this man, the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly. And here's 2 promises. He has come to all who have honestly sought him. And when we draw near to him, he discloses himself to us. So that's really step two. And they finish up step two at the beginning of chapter 5. And so I just want to take a couple minutes and go to page 60, where they do the A, B's, and C's, where they say our description of the alcoholic or the compulsive eater, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear three pertinent ideas. And these are the three things we need to believe before we can go on to step 3. A, that we were compulsive eaters and could not manage our own lives. That's pretty easy for most of us. That's why we all came in, right? B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism or our compulsive eating. That means no therapist, no boyfriend, no husband, no wife, no group, no human power, because our problem is lack of power. A group can give me good information and love and support, but they can't do a heart change in me. Only God can do that. They say, okay, so we have to believe we're compulsive eaters, can't manage our own life. No human power could relieve our compulsive eating. And then here's the tricky one, that God could and would if he were sought. So this is how I generally break it down with people. Do you believe that God exists? And if they say no, we've got to do more work on step 2, coming to believe. Do you believe that God exists? Yes. Do you believe that God can has removed the food obsession from other people? And then, of course, I say yes, because we've seen it. Do you believe God could remove your food obsession if he wanted to? And it's usually, well, yes, he's God. He can do anything. He could remove it if he wanted to. Do you believe he will remove it if you seek him? And this is where people often get stuck. Well, yes, he could remove it from me, but I don't believe he will. And I thought about it once, and I came up with a list of 5 reasons why people think God won't remove their obsession. That they've done some bad things, that they just don't deserve it. That's different than guilt over something bad. That's more shame, that they're just not worthy. That they caused this illness and therefore they're not entitled to help. That they've tried it so many times before and it hasn't worked. And or they're not willing to do the work to seek him. For the person who says they're not willing to do the work to seek them, I would say to that person, you're right. You can't expect God to restore you to sanity, because that's all throughout this book. We have to seek him. But to the person who says, I've done some really bad things, say, great, you're in great company. So did the founders of this big book. That's why they put an 8th and 9th step in, to make amends. You'll have a chance to fix it. All good. But if someone just says, I'm not worthy, to that person, I would say, you could go to therapy and spend a lot of money to have a therapist telling you you're worthy and have good self-esteem, or you can just realize that worthiness is not a requirement. This is not something we earn. It doesn't matter if we have shame or guilt. First, that'll all go away as we work the steps, by the way. But worthiness is never a requirement. Only willingness is, right? The requirements to work the steps. Want what we have, which is a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, and willing to go to any lengths to get it. There's no entrance requirements of worthiness. It's not there. Now, someone says, well, it's my fault that I have this illness. I mean, we can debate whether we're born with it, how we got it, but let's just say it's true that it's my fault that I got this illness. Well, then I think, okay, if I'm crossing the street and I'm looking at my cell phone and I get hit by a truck and both my legs are broken and the ambulance comes to take me to the hospital, okay, let's be honest. Not one of us would ever say to the ambulance driver, don't drive me to the hospital. It's my fault my legs are broken. I don't deserve help. We would never do that. But when it comes to God, it's like we get all noble, like, oh, I just can't go to God for help. Yes, we can. We can go to God for help. The fourth reason, if someone says, I've tried it so many times that it hasn't worked, I again pick up that cell phone and say, I may have tried 100 times to take pictures by pushing this button, but it doesn't work because this is the on off button, not the picture button. But if someone shows me the right button to push and I'm willing to listen and not say, no, I've been pushing this button 100 times and it may not work, but that's the only button I'm going to push. Well, then of course it wouldn't work. But if I say, oh, okay, you showed me, and now I am going to work really hard at pushing the right button to get pictures. I'll be able to get pictures. So it doesn't matter if you've tried. I tried for 6.5 years. I never left OA. And during those first 6.5 years, I never got more than 2 weeks of abstinence. And a lot of times I couldn't even make it to work without binging. It doesn't matter. When someone showed me this big book and showed me how to get a relationship with God and took the time to work with me so that I could do it, all those 6.5 years didn't matter. The obsession went away. And so if there's anyone who is struggling here tonight, there are plenty of people who have recovered and who are, just put your name and number in the chat that you're looking for help, and that, you will find someone who can help you put your hand in the hand of God. And with that, I will pass.